Well, I'm Mary Gentile, and I'm the creator and director of Giving Voice to Values, or GVV, as I refer to it, which is an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. And it all started for me. My first position in business education was at Harvard Business School. I was there from 1985 to 1995. And although I started as a case writer, I quickly took over managing and directing their entire case writing program for the business school, which was a really nice experience for me in terms of becoming better able to understand the pedagogy of case method teaching and case method writing, and also to become familiar with all the different disciplines, because I was working with people who were writing cases in finance, operations, marketing, OB, etc. And I did that for a few years. When I started, I was managing a group of about 30 case writers, and by the end it was over 60. And I also wrote a number of cases myself, several of which went platinum. And so I very much enjoyed that experience, but it wasn't ultimately satisfying for me. And I remember going to my manager at the time and saying, well, I'm going to leave. And she said, why? And I said, well, I want to do something that feels like it matters more. and she said, oh, is that is important to you? So she said, well, it just so happened that they had recently gotten some funding to develop a new course around ethics and values in business. And did I want to work on that? And I said, well, yeah, that sounded interesting. So I started out helping them to develop their first required curriculum around business ethics and leadership. And so I helped to create that, and I taught in it some. But after a few years, I became tired of that as well. And I told them what I really wanted to do was to design and create a course on what we were calling in those days managing diversity. What we now call, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And they said, oh, so you want to do that? So I created a proposal and taught the course. But they gave me a choice. They said I could either take 2 years of funding and research and support to develop this course and teach it, and then I could move on. Or I could have basically, lifetime employment, but I would work on what they thought was important. And at that point, what they wanted me to do was work on the internationalizing of the curriculum, which is a good thing. I had nothing against that, but I really felt like I wanted to do something that was meaningful to me. And at that point, I was really concerned about equity and inclusion. So I took door number one, and I developed the course, and it went quite well. And then I left. After that, it was sort of a matter of serendipity, I guess. I started doing consulting to business schools and to companies. And I started doing a lot of work with the Aspen Institute. The process went on from there. I think what was really important to me was when I was at Harvard Business School, one of the things I was really working on was looking at not just creating a course on ethics, but thinking about how can you integrate issues around ethical decision making and ethical action into the other core courses. So how can you integrate it into finance or marketing or operations? And I think that really helped me frame my thinking, because what I was seeing is that we could certainly design a course around ethics, but it didn't necessarily have anything to do with what was discussed in any of the other courses. And so that was kind of frustrating to me. And then the other thing that was frustrating to me is what we actually did in the ethics courses. We would approach it as if it was entirely a cognitive issue. We were always talking about creating a decision-making framework, right? And it was sort of like, we would have this black box, and you put in all the information one end, and the right answer would come out the other end, and then you were done. And I call it the preach and pretend method. We would preach to you about what was right, and then we'd pretend you could do it. And I was pretty frustrated and disillusioned with that. And so I actually decided to stop working in this area. I thought, I've got some other skills. I'll do some other kind of consulting, maybe it'll be around diversity, maybe it'll be around something else. But, I really became kind of disillusioned with this. But through a variety of experiences, which I can explain to you if you're interested, I ended up coming up with a different approach, which was the giving voice to values approach. Would you like me to go into detail about that, or?
Yes, very much, because I think that's what people want to hear.
Okay. Well, so, in this period where I had left Harvard Business School and was doing other kinds of consulting, and I have what I call a crisis of faith. I really began to think trying to teach about ethics in business education was at best futile and at worst hypocritical, because it seemed that we would have these conversations and we would discuss what is the right thing to do. And we would often set things up as debates, and we would teach people models of ethical reasoning, deontology and utilitarianism and virtue-based ethics, and we would apply it to ethical dilemmas. But to me, it felt, when I looked at what was actually being said in these conversations, it felt like a kind of schooling for sophistry, because I felt like students were learning to rationalize anything. In fact, I remember I did an interview with a gentleman. He was an entrepreneur and a CEO, and a number of people told me I should talk to him. He had a quite successful consumer products firm based in the US. It was privately held. And people said, oh, go talk to him. He's very thoughtful about values and ethics in business. And he told me this story. He said that he had one time been interviewing a young MBA graduates for a new position in his firm, a high potential position. And he said he was interviewing this one gentleman who had graduated from one of the top B schools in the US. And he asked him, did you take an ethics class in your MBA? And the guy said, yes, it was required. And so the CEO asked, well, what did you learn? And he said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you should decide what you want to do and then select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. Now, this wasn't what the professor was hoping this gentleman would walk away with. And the CEO who was telling me the story was sort of teasing me, right? Because I was the ethics lady. But I think that there's a lot of truth to this, that, these models of ethical reasoning conflict by design. They conflict. That's why they're valuable, because they allow you to see things from different perspectives. But they don't tell you what's right. And if you, in fact, decide that you think you know what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. So these kinds of experiences were starting to click with me, and I was also looking at what I actually saw happening in the classrooms and in corporate training rooms, and it seemed that, these conversations were not ending up with people feeling clear that they neither clear about what the right thing to do was, nor about how to get it done once they decided. And so for all of those reasons, I was somewhat disillusioned. But then I was doing some consulting. I was actually working with the Aspen Institute with their Business and Society program. And while doing that, I started to come across, this was, maybe about 14 years ago, I started to come across more and more research in psychology, social psychology, in neurosciences, in behavioral ethics and behavioral economics. And it was all sort of suggesting that if you want to have a real impact on people's behavior, that pre-scripting and rehearsal and peer coaching were effective strategies for doing that. I was really struck by a quote from the folks who do study positive deviance, and they say that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. And I thought that was an interesting idea, you know, and then I was looking at the research on habit formation and the research on, you know, brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways. And all of these things were starting to make me think that maybe there was a different approach. And I like to tell the story that one of the things that contributed to this was a self-defense class that I took when I was actually back working at Harvard Business School. I took a self-defense class in Boston. It was called Model Mugging. And most of the courses that you take would teach you physical moves, you know, like fist to bridge of nose or heel to instep or knee to groin. But this course would actually, they would teach you those moves. It was a developmental model, but then they would bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, and they would line us all up and we would take turns getting attacked by this gentleman. And you could use the moves you just learned on him because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you would just stand there waiting your turn to get attacked. But as time went on, you know, I might be talking to someone over here and he would come and grab me. I would never know when. And you would practice these moves. And they explained to us that it was based on some research from kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. And the idea was that if you practice something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if even if you freeze in the moment, that your body will remember. So, you know, the tennis pro will practice her serve over and over until she goes to tournament. And then when she's there under all that stress, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. So I'm in this class and I'm lying on the floor on my back because I have failed to protect myself, as I often did. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a kind of default to voice and action, but not just to speaking up? Because I was interviewing lots of people and gathering lots of stories. And one of the things I was learning is that the people who voiced and acted on their values effectively, it wasn't typically a matter of blowing the whistle or of, you know, shaking their fist and speaking truth to power, telling their boss that he or she was evil. It was usually something much more tactical, much more nuanced, you know, much more strategic. And so I was thinking, could you create a default to informed voice? Because the other thing I was learning from all these stories I was gathering is that the kinds of objections that people encounter when they are facing a values conflict or an ethical conflict, they're repetitious. They're fairly predictable. They're powerful, but they're not bulletproof. You know, so they're things like, oh, it's not material. You know, it's not a big enough deal to worry about. We'll wait till there's a real issue. Or, you know, it's just standard operating procedure in this industry, or in this organization, or in this part of the world. Or, you know, it may be problematic, but it's not my responsibility. It's above my pay grade. Or, yeah, there may be some questions here, but don't you feel loyal to your company or your manager or your customer or your colleagues, you know? And so those kinds of arguments would come up again and again, dressed up slightly differently. You know, they're powerful and they're very hard to respond to in the moment. But what I was also realizing is that people did find ways to respond to them, but you need to rehearse, you need to practice, you need to think through them in advance. And so for all of those reasons, I started thinking maybe there was a different approach. And that was the beginning of giving voice to values. I was working at the time as a consultant for the Business and Society program at Harvard, at the Aspen Institute. And there was the executive director of that program, Judy Samuelson, was an alum of the Yale School of Management. And at that time, Joel Podolny was dean of the Yale School of Management. He then went on to run the university at Apple Computer. And I think he's moved on from there now too. But at the time he was dean at Yale and he was going through a major curriculum revision. And so Judy, as an alum of Yale, reached out to him because she'd read somewhere in some alumni communication that they were interested in values. And she said, well, you know, we've got this person working with us, Mary, who's got this idea about values. And so he agreed to meet with me, and I spent like half a morning or half a day in his office one day and just kind of did this core dump of my idea. And he agreed to give some support, some financial support to the Aspen Institute to support me to explore the idea. So I spent some time, you know, reading and researching, and then writing up sort of some core ideas and developing a set of case materials, and then shared them. And, you know, he liked the idea. So he, you know, continued to fund us, and then Yale Publishing published the core book based on the work that I had developed. And then it kind of went on from there. We piloted it in a second-year elective at Yale that Ira Milstein taught on corporate governance. And, you know, Ira invited me to the law firm and spent a morning with him and one of his colleagues. And we generated a few corporate governance style GVV cases and taught them in the class. And the big difference between the GVV approach and a traditional case approach, which I was so familiar with from my work at Harvard, is that the cases typically are much shorter, number one. Secondly, they focus on people at every level in the organization, not just the CEO, because people start encountering these issues right away. But the big difference is they're what one dean, the then dean at Notre Dame Business School, Carolyn Wu, called post-decision making. In other words, they end with a protagonist who's already decided what he or she believes the right thing to do is. And the question is, how could they get it done effectively? And then we have a protocol of questions that we work people through. We have a lot of tools. We have hundreds of pieces of material now, cases and readings and exercises. And there's book series and MOOCs and interactive modules. And we're working with someone who's developing an app, and we've worked with some avatar simulations. So there's lots of different ways to do it. But the main thing is that we're asking people to work together to create action plans and scripts and solutions. And you know, I call it the giving voice to values thought experiment, because we never ask people, what would you do? Because we know from the research now that typically when you ask people what they would do, or when people encounter values conflicts, there is a kind of automatic emotional response, an unconscious response. You know, we kind of act on what we think is possible and then rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do or the only thing to do. Not because we're intending to be unethical, but rather because there's a self-protective tendency to want to avoid the cognitive dissonance, you know, that would occur when you know something's wrong and you do it anyways. And so it's self-protective. I think the first time I came across this idea was Jonathan Haidt's piece about the emotional tail that wags the rational dog, but there've been other work in that area. And so I don't ask people, what would you do? I don't want them to practice those rationalizations. Instead, I ask the thought experiment. What if you were this person, this protagonist, who has decided this is the right thing to do? How could you get it done effectively? And the idea here is that people are given permission. You know, you brought the stress down. We know people are more creative when they feel less stressed. And you've actually given them cover for, you know, crafting ethical responses. You know, they don't have to feel like they sound naive, you know, or Pollyanna-ish or something, but you actually say, and you ask them to do it with their peers. So they're actually kind of coming up with these arguments with the very people who would be the kinds of people they need to talk to about these issues. And we work them through a set of questions, you know, where they talk about what's at risk for everyone involved, not to do a stakeholder analysis, because they've already got someone who's decided what's right, but rather to figure out where are the risks and where are the opportunities in communicating with each of these individuals. How can I mitigate the risk for these people? How can I acknowledge what I'm asking them to do? How can I respond to some of their concerns? And we ask them to think about what are those objections, you know, the reasons and rationalizations I talked about earlier that you expect you might encounter, and then to literally script ways to respond to them, to think it through with your peers, and then to rehearse that, to share those action plans and scripts, and to work together to make them better, to do a kind of peer coaching around them, and to actually look at what the people in those actual circumstances did. In our cases, we like to have examples of people who found an effective way to do it, and we share those in our B case. Sometimes they didn't, but then what we do is we ask, well, how could they have been more effective, and we still get people to practice that. So the idea is that people are creating this new muscle memory. They're creating a habit of coming up with other ways of responding to these kinds of scenarios. So, that was basically the idea in the beginning, and it just kind of grew well beyond anything I ever anticipated. We started out working with business schools, which is what I had intended. But we started being approached by companies, and we started being approached by organizations, schools, and companies all over the world. We've worked with the U.S. military. We've worked with the Australian police force, with the the IAEA. We've worked with various UN agencies. So it's kind of grown beyond the original goals.
So this, you probably will say that this original idea has grown extraordinarily. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So you might talk about a little bit that. I mean, it's all over. It's everyone uses it. I mean, a lot of people use it. Not everyone, but a lot of business. It's just astonishing. So what did you do when you were at the Darden School?
Okay, so I actually, before I went to Darden, I was at Babson College for about 5 or 6 years, and I was sharing it widely at that point. And then I actually moved to Darden. And I was excited to move to Darden because Darden has such a reputation for really taking issues seriously around values and ethics in business curriculum. They've already done so much. And I'd known Ed Freeman since I'd been back at Harvard. And so we had stayed in touch. And so when I first came to Darden, I had a number of goals. One was I wanted to bring the whole curriculum that we'd developed to Darden Business Publishing so that it would continue to be available, around the world. And Darden was amazingly, what can I say, accommodating and generous, because I had been making the materials available for free up to that point. And they agreed to continue to make the legacy materials, which were hundreds of pieces of material, available for free. And since I've been at Darden, obviously we've developed a lot more materials, which we, sell through Darden Business Publishing. But they were great around that. And then I also worked with Darden because of their partnership with Coursera, and we developed a Giving Voice to Values MOOC, which has now I think there's been over 20,000 folks who have enrolled in it. But we've also worked with some organizations to adapt it. So, for example, the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, which is kind of like their OSHA, I guess, has worked with me to customize that MOOC to use with their members, so that we have the basic structure, the Giving Voice to Value structure, but then we include case examples that have to do with health and safety in organizations. And we also worked at the University of Virginia School of Engineering to adapt it for engineers. And it was actually piloted last fall at the School of Engineering at UVA to really good effect in this is their undergraduate engineering ethics course. It went very well. And so now it's being made available globally for free, the engineering adapted version of it, through what's it called? I think it's called the Science and Engineering Online Ethics Center, which was originally funded by the NSF, but it's now based at UVA School of Engineering, and it's directed by Professor Rosalind Byrne there, who I worked with to adapt the approach for engineering. And so, we did that. I also taught an elective at UVA Darden, which I called Leadership When It Really Counts, which is kind of an interesting course. It's got 3 components to it. The first component is Learn, where the students are introduced to the GVV methodology and practice with it. The second component is called Create, where they work in teams to create a GVV style scenario, something that in most cases they themselves experienced when they were working, and a solution. And then the third part of the course is called Teach, where they then teach their case to each other using a GVV method. And some of those cases then end up being revised and refined and added to the GVV curriculum collection. And so that I started teaching that. The first time I taught it at Darden, I co-taught it with Ed Freeman and Brian Moriarty, and we taught it as a 1-week intercession kind of course. And then the following year, I co-taught it with Brian, but we taught it as a regular second year elective, and it's continued. So now, even though I've recently resigned from Darden, Brian is continuing to take the course forward. It was actually oversubscribed this year, and I've been guest lecturing in it, but he's been running the course. So that's been exciting to have that become part of the curriculum there. And so it's been great at working at Darden. I've also done a couple programs with Darden Business Publishing for faculty and educators and corporate representatives outside of Darden to teach the approach. And I've been talking to Steve Mompers at Darden Business Publishing about continuing to offer some of those even now. And I did a little bit of exec ed. I taught in their the Customs and Border Protection program last summer, and did a session on GVV in there, which was interesting, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's what's been interesting to me about the way this has grown is certainly going across professions. Lately, there's been a lot of interest in applying GVV in tech ethics kinds of issues. And so the Deloitte Foundation actually funded a convening last fall on ethics and technology, and they asked me to do one of the keynotes on the GVV approach for that. But then they gave a gift to Darden to develop a series of GVV style tech ethics cases. So they funded 5, and I also then developed 3 others with colleagues. And so we've got now a collection of about 8 GVV cases, and they deal with issues like bias in algorithms in hiring decisions. They deal with issues around ransomware and responses and communication around that. They deal with issues around facial recognition technology and privacy and surveillance kinds of questions.
Oh my gosh.
So a whole lot, social media and the potential impacts on youth. So a whole lot of interesting tech-related ethics issues that we've now created a suite of those kinds of cases. And we've also been approached by folks who are interested in applying this in legal settings. So I've spoken to a number of law schools and legal organizations, professional associations of lawyers who've been interested in this. I've been working with Villanova Law School, and they've actually built GVV into their required curriculum for the law students there. And we're hoping to build on that actually now. And in the book series, I have a book series from Routledge Publishing. And in that series, we have a number of books that apply GVV to different topics. So we've got several on law. We've got one actually on giving voice to values for physicians. There's a program called the Aspen Ethical Leadership Program in Healthcare, which is not related to the Aspen Institute, but they still hold their convening in Aspen. And they convene once a year and bring together physicians and nurses and executives from healthcare corporations. And they try and identify what some of the cutting edge ethical issues are in the healthcare profession. They develop some short cases and they discuss them. And they always invite me to do a presentation, sort of a pre-conference presentation of the GVV methodology, because then throughout the program, it's like a 3 or 4 day program, when they work through these cases in groups and then share their solutions and responses, they do a sort of a double approach. They first discuss the issue and kind of decide what they think is an appropriate response, an ethical response. And then they use the GVV methodology to talk about how you might actually enact that. And so that's been really interesting to me to see them apply that in a healthcare setting. And I've had the opportunity to share it with Kaiser Permanente does a bioethics conference every 2 years, and a leadership program at the Mayo Clinic, and some hospitals and medical schools in Australia. And I've actually recently been doing programs for grand rounds for schools of psychiatry. First one I did was at Yale, and then I've done another one since then. I've been working with the national nursing ethics groups to apply the approach. So it's interesting when you start applying it across professions. Certainly when I started working with the military, I mean, they're not my peeps, but but you start identifying what the issues are that are relevant for them, and then talking about this. I had some interesting experiences when I went to West Point. I remember talking to a gentleman there who worked with, what was it called? The Center for Character and Leadership, I believe. It was they've changed their name and they've actually moved now. But at the time they were based at West Point, and they would design the ethics training for, at the time it was 1.3 million enlisted and civilian Army employees. And he was interesting because he was sharing with me what they already had developed, which was a lot of stuff. And much of what they did was case-based around, actual scenarios that folks had faced. And it was interesting. One example he shared was a woman who was an officer who had witnessed some abusive behavior online on their internal internet communication. And if you're an officer, they have a saying, that basically you're responsible for everyone, not just your unit. And so even though it wasn't someone who was in her unit, she responded online about how inappropriate this particular behavior and commentary was. And she was quickly just ganged up on. It was like there was blood in the water, and there were many people kind of attacking her, to the point where they had to take her communications off the internal internet. And so they were using this as a case, and one of the things I was talking to them about was, well, do you think this is really going to encourage people to speak up? Because she was so horribly attacked for doing so, even though she was an officer, And so I said, from a GVV perspective, we might do this a little bit differently, And so one of the things that we might do is say, here's an example of something that happened. How could you effectively respond to this? And and then look at what we know about behavior on the internet. And we do know from research that there are waves, right? People start saying things and everyone piles on, And I said, so if you were using this as a teaching case from a GVV perspective, you might share the triggering event, right? And then you might have this protagonist who wants to respond, but then talk about how could she be most effective. And so one idea might be to contact a whole group of folks, both officers and not officers, and say, I'm going to respond to this at 9:02. I want you to respond to my response at 9:03 and 9:04 and 9:06, and to create your own beginning of a wave, And so then you're informed by what we know about internet behavior. You're still voicing, your concern, but you're not suggesting to someone that they have to go out there and be a sacrificial lamb in this circumstances, So those were the kinds of things that we would discuss. When I first started sharing Giving Voice to Values, I heard from a number of business school faculty in the West, mostly in the US and some in Western Europe, who said, well, this is kind of interesting, Mary, and it might work here, but it really won't work and then they fill in the blank, and it won't work in China, it won't work in India, it won't work in Africa, it won't work in Russia, it won't work in the Middle East, or South America. And, I thought, well, they might be right. I'm Mary Gentile from Boston. I'm not sure if this will be effective in those places. But I started getting invited to all of those places, and have actually had really positive experiences. But I've learned a few things about using it in a cross-cultural context. I like to tell a story about, I think, which illustrates this. One of the early international experiences was in India, and I got invited to share Giving Voice to Values as a 2-day program by the National Entrepreneurship Network of India, NEN. And they wanted me to do a 2-day program in Bangalore and a 2-day program in Delhi. And it was going to be, a group of faculty who taught entrepreneurship in India, Indian faculty and Indian entrepreneurs. And the same thing happened in both cities. And it was basically that I would walk in the morning of the first of the 2 days, and there were a group of people sitting there, and they were all kind of sitting, smiling, with their arms crossed, kind of leaning back in their chairs, sort of smirking at me, and I sort of thought, oh dear. And so I said, well, what is it? What's going on? And finally some brave soul would say, well, madam, we're delighted you're here. And we're really happy to listen to you talk about giving voice to values. But you have to understand that this is India, and we are entrepreneurs, and in India you really can't even you can't even get a driver's license without paying a bribe, and so this is really not relevant for us, but we're very happy to listen to you, and so I thought, okay, and I learned that I had to do 5 things in order to be able to have this conversation go in a constructive way. So the first thing that you have to do is to acknowledge the reality of the context. And so the first thing I said was, well, this is not my first trip to India. I've been to India many times. I know that a lot of what you're saying is true. I've been approached myself, not for a driver's license, but for other things. So you acknowledge the reality of the context. And then the second thing you have to do is to acknowledge that nevertheless, the folks you're dealing with, that they do have values, and that this real context we're talking about can make it challenging for them to act on their values. And so you're not there to say, act the way I would act in Boston and it'll work for you, but rather to understand, given this context, given that you have a set of values, how can we help you find effective ways to act on them? So you're starting from that position of respect, and assuming that that you don't have to tell them what their values are. They have values. And then the third thing that you have to do is explain what I just explained, which is the giving voice to values thought experiment, which is that I'm not going to give you a scenario and ask what's the right thing to do, or even what would you do. I'm going to give you a scenario where a protagonist knows what they believe the right thing to do is, and I'm going to ask you, how could they get it done in this context? And so what that does is it brings the pressure down so that people can be more creative, and it sort of sets their minds at ease that this is a problem-solving kind of encounter, as opposed to a preaching kind of encounter. And then the fourth thing that I learned I have to do is, wherever possible, to try and have an example from that context of someone doing this effectively. So in India, I happened to have a video case that I had done with an Indian entrepreneur who had purchased a company from one of the major multinationals. It was a company that produced Indian packaged foods, and they produced them in India, but their market was primarily the West, US, Australia. And when this Indian gentleman purchased this company from a major multinational, it was near bankruptcy, it was violation of Indian labor laws, and it was quite corrupt. And in the space of 2 years, this gentleman had turned it around. It was financially doing really well, and it was seen as a model of clean behavior. And so when I had met with this gentleman, he'd shared some scenarios of the kinds of conflicts he faced, often initially state-owned employees, state employed individuals who were coming to inspect his his property, his manufacturing facilities, and would require a bribe in order to pass them. And he created, he told me how he dealt with those scenarios. So I shared this video interview with this gentleman where he would set up the challenge, and then, they would discuss it for a while. And then I had a video of him talking about how he had resolved it. And so it did a couple things. I mean, the first thing it did is it triggered a sense of pride, right? It was, here's somebody in our country, of our nationality who is doing this effectively and successfully and being quite successful at it. But then it also sort of triggered a little bit of competition. If he can do it, I can do it. So that was the fourth thing, is you always, if you can, to try and have a positive example like that. And then the fifth and final thing was that, I explained to them that this is as I said earlier, that this is a thought experiment, and I'm not going to ask you what would you do, but I'm going to ask you, how could you get the right thing done? And what I found is when I do these 5 things, and actually I've written this up in a little post that's at Harvard Business Review online. You can look at it, called Talking About Ethics Across Culture. When I do those 5 things, that people got really engaged, and they actually were so into it that they kind of were lapsing into Hindi. But fortunately, I had a colleague, a friend who I'd asked to co-teach with me. And so she was whispering in my ear, what they were actually coming up with, And so I find that it works well across cultures, and you're appealing to an aspiration that people have. But you're not acting as if you have the answers for them. You're acknowledging their context. You're starting from that respectful position, and then people get into it because they understand what you're trying to do. So that's been an interesting learning for me. And since then, we have used this all over the world, in all those places that I mentioned earlier, and have had positive responses to them. So that's been an interesting, and I guess the last thing I'd say about using this in different contexts is going into corporate settings. And when I first was invited to go into corporate settings, the expectation was that I would come in and give a presentation about why you should be ethical. And I would always explain, well, that's not what I do. And if that's what you want, let me recommend some people I know who do that really well. But I said, but what I do is say, well, what if you wanted to act ethically? How could you get it done? And I lead that conversation. And so that was always a bit of a switch. And often when I would speak with senior leaders, there would be this moment of, huh? It's like, that's what you're going to do. But what happened is that companies started responding very positively to that because they saw it as leadership development. And, because
it is
being able to raise issues, even if they're not ethical issues, when there's a lot of prevailing winds, is in fact an attribute of leadership. And so that was part of what I think made it so attractive to many companies. I think one of the most exciting things that I'm doing with companies right now is the work I've been doing for the last few years with KPMG, where we took that course that I described earlier with the learn, create, teach, and we adapted it for use within the firm. And so we did some initial introductions to all of, 33,000, domestic employees about what GVV is and got them to practice with it. But now we've run multiple cohorts of what they're calling the GVV Master Facilitators Program, where we work with managers and partners to run them through that learn, create, teach, where they create KPMG specific and function specific, whether it's audit or tax or business processes, scenarios, and then practice teaching them. And then they are then sent out to do that kind of teaching within their own KPMG learning establishment. So it's a way of building this greater and greater cohort of people who are both able to facilitate this kind of conversation and hopefully also then apply these things in their own management experiences. So those are a few of the ways that we've shared it across across organization, across function, across culture.
So Mary, just one thing, you're talking about KPMG, right? Good. Sorry, I just in the beginning it got kind of blurry. Okay.
Oh,
good.
sorry. Yes.
Well, that's all right. I just that this happens, and then I get doing the transcripts, and I think, who is that? All right, great. That's wonderful. So I love hearing that. That's fantastic. I love this. It's great. This is wonderful. Do you want to talk just a little bit about how do you see the future? What challenges are we all going to face, both as
Yeah,
academics and
yeah. It's a great question. I've been thinking about that. And I'm finding when I give talks now and when I do programs now, especially when I do programs internationally. I just did a program virtually in Ghana a couple of weeks ago, and almost always someone will ask a question that has to do with the current state of what should I say, state of discourse in the United States and also globally, and discourse around everything, you know, certainly around politics, around science and healthcare, in the media, on social media, you know, all of these kinds of debates. And I think when I think about the future, I think, of course, there are all the ethical challenges that we've always had. I mean, it's human nature, right? Some of the kinds of things I was talking about earlier, you know, it's not a big enough deal, and, you know, all of that. And certainly there are lots of new issues that are arising because of technology, you know, issues around privacy or bias, or, you know, in algorithms, or security, and all of that. But in addition to all of that, for me, I think one of the big issues is that right now we have a lot of voice. I think we have maybe more voice than we've had in the past, partly encouraged by social media. But we don't have a lot of discussion, you know? And so, you know, I think that what GVV is not about, as I said earlier, you know, whistleblowing or speaking truth to power and shouting out, this is wrong. It's really about thinking strategically and tactically about how do you communicate with somebody around these issues and influence them, persuade them, or in some cases, change your own mind, you know, in a constructive way, or find some common ground. And it's about learning how to have that conversation. And it's about giving the person that you're trying to influence a way to be in the conversation so that they don't have to I have a good way to put this. I saw an interview with a psychiatrist. I think it was in the New York Times. I can't remember his name, but it was after the 2016 election, when in the US there was such contested, you know, viewpoints, still are. And he said, I thought it was a really interesting line. He said, if you really want to have a conversation with someone whose position differs with you that greatly, that you have to find a way to express your views so that in order for them to hear you, they don't have to stand in a place of humiliation. And I think that that's a lot of what GVV is about. It's about not saying something is right if you think it's wrong, but finding a way for the person to come to understand your point of view without having to feel humiliated. They may have to change their mind, but you're giving them a way to have this conversation with you. It's not easy, but we find people who are able to do that. And a lot of it is framing the conversation around learning. But I think right now we have more voice, I think, especially from employees, partly because of social media, but we don't necessarily have that kind of conversation. And I think that's a big challenge, you know, all of these issues I'm mentioning in technology and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's all real. But there's always new issues, you know, and we've gone through finding new issues in the past when businesses first started to go global, for example. But I think the issue about how we communicate, for me, is the piece that we really need to spend some time on.
But I wonder if you have anything more you would like to add to this?
Well, I guess the last thing I would just say is that, you know, people will often say, well, what's the one thing you want people to take away, you know, from giving voice to values? And, you know, I usually say, well, it's all about asking a different question. So instead of asking what's right, that's an important question. It's about asking, once you know what's right, how do you get it done? And what I like people to feel hopefully after experiencing GVV is that you know, they may have more choices than they think they did, you know, so.
Good. Well, thank you just so much. This was great. I'm sorry we had to wait so long to do this, but we both had schedules that wouldn't work very well. So thank you, thank you. And Tom, do you have any other questions? Tom usually
I find it very fascinating your approach. You take, very singular furrow. One thing I did wonder during it, because you've taken quite a cross-disciplinary approach in it, from social psychology, business side, and ethics, obviously in the philosophical tradition. Did you find it a collaborative sort of cooperation, or was there any pushback there?
That's a great question. Tom, in the beginning, I found really welcoming response from companies and from faculty who didn't teach ethics, who knew that, they wanted their students to be ethical. They just didn't want to have to feel like they had to be philosophers in the classroom, So I found that, but the pushback I did encounter in the beginning was from philosophers. And what's interesting, though, is that has changed. And I've actually lately been being invited by philosophers, to speak. And also, when I went to Australia, one of my hosts there actually ran a whole symposium with philosophy faculty and philosophy graduate students who all read my book and then commented on it from different philosophical perspectives. So that seems to have changed. I always say I was inspired by Aristotle. So, it's all about practice, and so, that seems to have changed. But in the beginning, that was where I experienced the most pushback.
Well, I think that's as a single point of origin for everybody. That's where you go back to, right? Yeah.